Hi guys, it's Caroline, and today I'm bringing you my November wrap-up. Now, I read 14 books in November, and I'm gonna get right on into it because there's a bunch of them. First up is Bring Up the Bodies, which is about Thomas Cromwell. It's the second in the Wolf Hall trilogy. It took me forever to finish this. I think it was like a 2-month journey, and I finally was able to finish it off because I picked it up on audiobook, and that helped me speed through it. There's nothing wrong with this book. I don't have any big issues with it. When I'm reading it, I'm engaged, but there's literally nothing about this series that has ever compelled me to pick it up. Like when I'm sitting there and I have a choice to read, I always choose to pick whether it's the other audiobook, the other physical book that I'm reading. I just always pick something else because this book doesn't have any forward momentum. It sort of plods along, and you also know what happens because it's based on history, so it never really captured my attention, even though while I was reading it I was interested. So because of that, I gave it a 3 stars. It wasn't my favorite. I'm still probably going to read the 3rd book despite the fact that it's like really, really long, just because I'm so far in this series and everyone loves it, and maybe it'll grow on me. I don't know. Next up was an audiobook. I read a children's Bible and I listened to that one on audiobook. It was interesting. It was sort of this climate dystopia, although dystopia is maybe a strong word. And there's these children and they have parents, and they've all kind of come to this house, and the children are playing a game where they're trying to guess whose parents are belong to which kids. Because the parents are kind of doing their own thing. They're not doing a great job parenting. And one of the little kids, he finds a Bible, and there's a lot of sort of parallels between the climate disasters that are happening and things in the Bible. It was interesting. I enjoyed it while I read it. I just think that as soon as I finished it, I forgot so much about it. So I think it was super forgettable, although everyone talks about it being one of the best books of the year, and I really had a good time while I was reading it. But weeks later, I was kind of like, wait, if someone asked me to describe that book, how would I? And I couldn't do it. I gave it a 3.5 stars though, because I did really like it while I was reading it. Next up was a reread for me, and that was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and I loved this book. I really liked it the first time I read it when I was in high school, and I really loved this reread this time around. It just captures so much about Gothic literature, but also it has so much to say about women, both the main character who's left unnamed and Rebecca, who's sort of painted as this villain because of her sexuality and her outgoingness and her willingness to go and get what she wants. It's such a flip. I don't want to give too much away, but basically about halfway through the story you figure out what's going on, and then you're almost rooting for the bad guy. It's just like a complete, I don't know, it just turns the whole genre on its head while also being such a good example of what the genre means and what the genre does. I gave that 5 stars. Next up, I read A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius by Dave Eggers, and I disliked this so much. I thought it was bland, dry, boring, and he tried so hard to be funny, and it just was painful to read. It's like someone when they're trying to show off, and it hurts your heart because you know what they're trying to do and they're doing it so poorly, and you feel embarrassed for them. That's how I felt reading this book. I just felt embarrassed for this guy. And then it was also this memoir. It's about him being like a young 20s, raising his younger brother after the death of his mother, and he's starting this magazine. It's the guy, I'm pretty sure he now runs McSweeney's, but he just didn't have an interesting enough inner life, and he thought he had a really interesting inner life, but he kept making jokes about how all he wanted to do was smoke pot, and all these jokes about how messy the house was, and what the kind of stuff he did raising his brother. And I found it really dysfunctional, not funny. It made me really worried for his younger brother, and then also his inner life I didn't find interesting. And the whole time I just was cringing because I just don't find him funny in the slightest. I don't think I laughed a single time, and that book is supposed to be laugh out loud funny. So I really did not like it. I gave it 2 stars. It put me in a reading slump, which is why I only read 14 books when I've been reading closer to 18 or 22. But it's not all Dave Eggers' fault, because at the same time as I was reading that, I was also listening to Midnight Sun on audiobook, which is not only bad, but also 26 hours long. So I was reading 2 things, audio and physical, that I disliked, and that really slowed me down. But Midnight Sun was longer than it deserved to be. It has no new plot points, so I don't know why she needed to write this huge, huge book. And it honestly, made the series so much worse. I always kind of gave Edward the benefit of the doubt. I never fully understood why this vampire would be interested in this young teenage girl, especially when Bella in the original series seemed so bland. But then this book makes him seem so shallow that he's really only there because he's obsessed with her blood. Like, he just seems so dysfunctional. He's like a curmudgeon-y old man, but also like the hormonal, horny teenage boy, all melded into one. And a lot of the stuff that when you think about it is problematic about the Twilight series in terms of like a relationship and like power imbalance and all of that, like this book recognizes it, and like he'll just be like, haha, but I didn't mean it like that. Or, because Edward's so territorial over Bella in like kind of a weird possessive way that always made me uncomfortable. And in this book, he still feels it, and we constantly have to hear him in his head being like, oh, she's mine, hands off, all of this jealousy. And he sort of laughs it off like, haha, what a human emotion. And I'm like, yeah, have we not like progressed past the point of realizing how problematic this is? Anyway, it was painful. Also, all the vampires except for Carlisle and Alice were awful. Next, and so I gave that 2 stars. Next up, I read 3 Women, and this is another book that just really disappointed me. I really wanted to like it. The idea is it's a nonfiction book, and it's about 3 different women, and it's supposed to be sort of this interrogation on female desire. One woman has a husband who like won't ever kiss her, and that's all she wants, so she has an affair with this like awful guy. Another one, she has a husband who likes it when she hooks up with other men, and either he's there or he watches. Then another one is a young girl who had a relationship with her teacher, and years later then brings it to court, and it's kind of about her court case. I just found it kind of boring. I didn't find myself relating particularly to any of the women, not just in like a scenario basis, but I just like couldn't find any of their desires like plausible to me. Like, I just found like for example, the one whose husband never kissed her, she just like throws herself at this guy who seems so awful and terrible and like yucky and gross and just awful. And I was just like, what are you doing? Like, the whole time I just wanted to shake each of them. I didn't find them that interesting. And then looking back at it, I just was like, how are these 3 white women supposed to kind of stand in for all of female desire? I thought it was kind of like a shallow premise. I didn't understand why this was like important to read, and then I just didn't connect with any of the, pieces. So I was just a little bit like, why did I read that? And so I gave that one 2.5 stars as well. As you can see, I was having a real rough time for a little bit in November. But then I read Nevermore, aka The Trials of Morgan Crow. I listened to it on audiobook, and this was what I needed because it was so cute. It was so adorable. And even though it's a middle grade, for whatever reason, I was nervous about it because I thought it would feel really babyish, but it doesn't at all. It has such whimsical vibes. It like has so much going on, and although a lot of people have compared it favorably to Harry Potter and stuff like that, I don't think it's by any means a knockoff. It's clearly its own thing, but it does have that vibe, that whimsical school setting, but it's not fully set in a school. I just can't rave about it enough. I can't wait to read the other 2 that are already out. I think it was just such a good palate cleanser for me because it wasn't like, it didn't take up a lot of brain power, but it was just so much fun. I laughed, I smiled, and I couldn't wait to pick up my phone so I could listen to more of it. So that was really what I needed, and I gave that one 4.5 stars. And then next I read Chuggy Bane, which while I was reading it actually ended up winning the Booker, which was kind of cool. And I haven't had my full thoughts on whether I think of the short list, I think this one should win. However, I did really enjoy it. It's like a Victorian in the sense that if you asked me about the plot, like I couldn't really tell you because it's really just about someone's life and nothing crazy happens except for everything that happens is crazy because his mother suffers from alcoholism and like is a really bad alcoholic, and Chuggy grows up with that. Like his older siblings leave him because they just can't be around his mother's destructive behavior. She goes through cycles. Sometimes she's not, sometimes she is sober, and I mean it's just heartbreaking. Written in Scottish dialect, and I also which is very well done, and I also think it talks about something that we don't often talk about, which is like Ireland and Scotland and sort of their plight, because I think we kind of see it as just the general UK and whatever, but I mean England has really messed up those places and really made its mark and hurt like the working class there. And, you know, we talk a lot about colonialism, which we definitely should, but we often like don't talk about the issues in like Scotland or Ireland. And I think that this was just an interesting glimpse into sort of that life, especially after the like ramping down of the Industrial Revolution and the effects of that upon people who worked in factories and worked in coal mines. So I just think it was really interesting. It was well written. It was beautiful. The ending hurt my heart. Then I listened to Cast on audiobook, which I thought was super informative. I really enjoyed that. I'm glad that I picked it up. I understand why there's all this hype around it. I gave it 4 stars instead of 5, which I normally have been giving my anti-racist reading 4.5 or 5 stars because I've been finding it so enlightening. I did dock this one a point just because I felt like the book says, hey, what we have in America is a caste system, much like the caste system in India. Here's how it's similar, here's how it's different, but I'm just gonna show you the fact that we have a caste system in America. And I believe that, and the book did a really good job explaining that and proving its point. However, it was kind of a lengthy book, and I would say about an hour into the 14 hours, I was completely sold, hey, yes, we have a caste system. And yeah, I learned a lot from the next 13 hours about the nuanced ways in which that we employ this caste system and what we do and how, you know, other countries view us and view how we treat people of different races, particularly Black people in America. And I think it was really enlightening. My only issue is I felt that it was a little bit like backward facing in the sense that it was just sort of like historically and up until today, this is like what we have, and it just sort of like dropped the mic. This definitely gave you the framework, but it didn't really give me like actionable items as an individual. It was more just like, on the whole, this is what our system's doing and this is what our system needs to not be anymore. You know, I don't know if that's like its fault. I don't know if that book is supposed to necessarily do that, and maybe it's on me for expecting that of it, but yeah, those are my thoughts. So I gave that 4 stars. Next up is Sheets, which is a graphic novel that a lot of people have really been talking about that I really wanted to check out. I got it from my library, picked it up, sat on the beach and read it in one day, or one sitting even. And I really had a good time with that. I really loved the artwork, and I think it did a beautiful job rendering it. My only complaint is that I think that it was just a little bit off kilter, and because it's a graphic novel and it had this like otherworldly element, it just sped through the concept a little bit too fast, and it was difficult for me to suspend my disbelief the whole way. I know it's supposed to be silly and fun, but just because it was so fast and it was like this ghost world with these sheets along with the real world, there were just some things that like kind of drew me out of the story because I just didn't believe them. But the artwork was beautiful and it had such good vibes, so I gave that 3.5 stars out of 5. Next up, I read The Alice Network. Now, I don't know why it took me so long to get around to this. I love historical fiction. I think historical fiction's the best, and then I always read way less of it than I mean to, but I'm so glad I finally got around to this. I kind of had low expectations, even though I've had so many people tell me I need to pick this up, and boy, did I love it. I gave it 4.5 stars. I think it does the dual timeline thing very, very well. Particularly because the World War I timeline is a spy timeline. The World War II timeline is trying to uncover a mystery of sorts, and it does a really great job of balancing the information we're given piece by piece without, like, while it still makes sense. But this very naturally, had a very natural flow, and it made sense why we got the information we got at the times we got it. It also just, like, hurts your heart. It shows you, like, how much impact women can have on fighting and war, despite the fact that we tend to think of men as the soldiers and the politicians that lead it, and women just play such a big part partially because they're underestimated, because people don't expect a woman to be a spy. A woman can be a better spy. So, I just thought it was beautiful. My 2 biggest complaints about this book, one is just that, like, there's no real good explanation given for why the main character goes to the house of the other main character and why the third main character is working for the one main character. You're just like, it's very convenient that they all found each other. The other thing is the one main character is supposed to be this like math genius girl who went to college for math, and I tutor math, and it was very funny because clearly this author is like not a math person. So like in one scene someone asks her like, oh, what's your favorite theory? And she says the Pythagorean theorem, and I was just like, whose favorite theorem is the Pythagorean theorem? This author only knew one theorem, so she picked that. But anyway, I gave that 4.5 stars out of 5. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Now, I had such a wild ride with this. So I have been anticipating this all year, and then I saw mostly positive reviews, but one friend she DNF'd it and she didn't like it, and I was nervous. So I went into it, and the first 200 pages are very, very slow, and I love V.E. Schwab, I love her writing, but I found it to be slightly overwritten, and I wasn't fully in love with Addie because I just felt like her character, her main point was to say, like, if people forget you and it's hard to make your mark, then it's really easy to feel lonely, it's really hard to feel like a person, and life is tough that way. And I agree, but I felt like I captured that essence very early on, and I didn't need 200 pages to kind of warm up. And I thought the history was interesting, but I mean, it was a slow ramp up, and it made me really nervous. But then once Henry was introduced, I was a lot more into it. Then the parts that felt overwritten, I was so engaged and engrossed in their relationship that I was okay with the fact that it was this like lofty language, and then I really actually liked it, and the quotes seemed really appropriate and beautiful and wonderful. And then like the last 150 pages where like things get real and things are happening and things are emotional and the stakes actually are like presented to us, that was when I really became truly interested and I fell in love with this book. Some people have said they don't like the ending, but I think the ending is really apt, and I think V.E. Schwab does a great job because after all, this is a story about a girl who's essentially immortal. So how do you give a satisfying ending point to a story that could go on and on and on? And I think she did a really great job crafting a reason why you got to the last page of this book. So I gave that one 4.5 out of 5 stars. Second to last is Piranesi, another beautiful cover and book. Piranesi is hard to describe. It's about this man who's in this giant house where there's floods and tides, and it's like beautiful architecture, and there are all these statues, and he's cataloging the statues. I don't want to say too much more because it's not a very long book, and the whole book is kind of figuring out like what the heck is going on. I was halfway through this book and I was like, I don't know what's happening. And my mom, who'd already read it, was like, exactly, but keep reading. And I do really enjoy where this book went. I enjoy the twists and turns it made. I think it was interesting and magical and whimsical without being so outlandish that I was like, I felt cheated, because it did have an ending and a twist and a turn that I think was appropriate, but without being too terribly guessable, because like a quarter of the way through, you're like, this could be anything. I have no idea. My only complaint is that because everyone hyped this up, including my mom and some of my friends on Goodreads, I kind of expected in the final pages there to be one final twist. I closed the book and I was like, I wanted something one step spicier. But otherwise, I mean, it's beautiful. I really do think that Susanna Clarke has a wonderful mind. I want her to write about magic for forever, and not make us wait that many years for her next book. But that's all. And then my final book is Tangerine. Now, this one I listened to on audiobook despite the fact that I own it, and I think the narrator did a good job kind of keeping the suspense. This is kind of blurbed as a Patricia Highsmith meets Hitchcock, and I can totally see that, and I think the audiobook narrator did a good job trying to keep up that suspense. It's about a woman who moves with her husband to Tangier, and then her college roommate follows her about a year later and like shows up at her door, and it's sort of the unspooling of their relationship, what's going on with this woman in Tangier, and things start to get a little weird. You realize their relationship's not exactly what it seemed in the first chapter. And I do think it's interesting, but again, this is one of those where like halfway through you saw exactly where it was going, not because I was so smart and I figured it out, but because it literally tells you exactly where it's going, and then it just keeps going there, and you're like, okay, but like, what about it? And it was interesting and fun, and I think the setup was cool, and I think it did a good job capturing the vibes, particularly in the first half when things were new. But then by the end, I was sort of a little bit bored, and I was just kind of waiting for it to wrap up. And sometimes that's a problem with thrillers, is they do that, or they snap the twist at you with too little time to negotiate it. So I don't know, take your pick. So I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. But yeah, those are the 14 books I read. 7 of them were audiobooks, 7 of them were physical books, which I think is a pretty good breakdown. But yeah, that's it for my November wrap up. Bye.